Imagine this. You walk through a dimly lit hallway, lined with clocks ticking out of sync. Each step echoes like a countdown, not toward an end, but toward a beginning that never should have happened. In your hand, a letter yellowed with age, written by a man whose signature matches your own, yet dated 50 years before your birth. The message is simple. If you want to fix everything, go back to 1923. Stop him before he meets her. You know who him is, your grandfather, and her, your grandmother. Your own genesis is the crime. Here begins the unraveling of reality, one that doesn't simply break the laws of time, but dismembers the very logic upon which causality hangs. The grandfather paradox isn't a mere sci-fi trope. It's a philosophical sinkhole, a psychological trapdoor. It whispers the possibility that cause and effect aren't as linear as we've built our civilizations upon. It dares to suggest that the past might be malleable, but that any finger placed upon it could cause everything to dissolve, including the finger, the hand, and the mind that dared touch it. You kill your grandfather before your parent is conceived, so you're never born. But if you're never born, then who went back and killed him? And if he was never killed, then you're born. And you go back again. You kill. You're erased. You don't kill. You're born. You kill again. A loop. An inescapable, eternal, absurd loop. Not just a knot in time, but a contradiction so perfect it sings like a siren to the curious mind. We pride ourselves on logic, on understanding beginnings and endings. We construct meaning around origins, birthdays, anniversaries, historical landmarks. We crave a cause for every effect. But the grandfather paradox is a bomb placed beneath this certainty. It explodes the story we tell ourselves about how the world works. Ask yourself, what happens when effect erases its cause? Can something both exist and not exist in the same breath of time? Can the future be more powerful than the past? Or does the past become fiction the moment it is rewritten? It's not just about time travel. It's about identity, memory, legacy. It's about the terrifying possibility that your own existence is not fixed, not even probable, but conditional. A house of cards balanced on a single moment in the past that could be undone with a thought. Would you do it? Would you press the trigger, knowing that your own life might vanish like breath on glass? And more hauntingly, what if you did it and nothing changed? What if your grandfather still died, but you remained, displaced from the laws of time, an orphan of causality? The horror here is subtle, not cinematic. It is the horror of unraveling, of becoming a ghost in a system that no longer recognizes you, a misfit particle, a sentence in a book that has been erased. There's irony here too, stunning in its cruelty. The more knowledge we gain about the universe, the less stable we find our place in it. Quantum mechanics reveals a world where particles influence each other across space instantly, where events can be probabilistic, not deterministic, where timelines might fork or branch or collapse altogether. In this landscape, time travel isn't impossible, it's ambiguous. So what do you do with ambiguity that can swallow you whole? Some argue that the universe would protect itself, that if you tried to kill your grandfather, the gun would jam, or he'd slip on a banana peel, or you'd suddenly change your mind. These are the theories of the self-healing timeline, where paradoxes are like wounds that the universe instinctively seals. But others propose something far darker, the multiverse, a place where your act doesn't erase you, it simply displaces you. You kill your grandfather in that branch of time and are cast out into a splintered world where you are a visitor with no origin, a shadow among people who don't know you, in a history you no longer belong to. In this vision, the price isn't non-existence, it's alienation. And isn't that somehow worse? To exist, but not matter. To walk through a world where you have no past, and therefore no context, no story. Is existence even meaningful without a thread that connects you to something before? These aren't merely metaphysical games. The grandfather paradox, presses on wounds we rarely speak of. The fear that we're unrooted, that memory is fragile, that our lives might be more contingent than we can bear. There's something in us that wants to go back, to fix the wrong, turn, to undo the pain, to whisper into the ear of a younger self or a dying parent, to make a different choice. But what the grandfather paradox tells us, hauntingly, inevitably, is that time is not a river we can wade backward into without, turning it to blood. And here's where it grows intimate, where it reaches not just into physics, but into psyche. Because many of us live inside mental versions of the paradox. We obsess over things we cannot change. We mentally time travel to the worst moments, fantasizing about undoing them. We imagine ourselves as both savior and executioner of our past. But every time we rewrite the memory, we distort the present. We become emotionally unanchored. The line between what happened and what could have happened blurs. So maybe the grandfather paradox isn't just theoretical. Maybe it's psychological, existential. Maybe the past is a kind of grandparent we all long to confront and cannot. And if you could meet your grandfather before your parent was born, would you ask him questions instead of killing him? Would you ask what made him love? What made him stay? What hurt him so badly that it still echoes in your bones? Or would you be tempted, just for a moment, to change it all? There's a quiet violence in that temptation, a denial of all the pain and beauty that followed, a rejection of the dominoes that led to your smile, your breath, your very consciousness. Because here's the final irony. We are all time travelers, in a way. Not because we move back, but because we carry the past forward, in our genes, in our choices, in the words we use and the loves we crave. And maybe, just maybe, the paradox isn't something to be solved. Maybe it's something to be accepted, that we are made of contradictions, that our lives are built upon impossibilities. That to be human is to live in a loop of memory and desire, cause and regret. You cannot go back, but you can look back and not flinch. And in that, perhaps, you are not trapped in time. You are transcending it. Liar's paradox. Imagine this. You walk into a room where a single sign hangs on the wall. It reads, in plain black letters, "This sentence is false." You stare at it. Simple enough. But as your mind begins to untangle the statement, something starts to warp. If the sentence is true, then it is false. But if it's false, then it must be true. You try again. Truth implies falsehood, and falsehood implies truth. You realize with a slow dread that the sentence doesn't mean what a sentence is supposed to mean. It's not broken. It's functioning perfectly within a broken logic. You've just met the liar's paradox, a sentence that devours itself. Language is supposed to be a bridge between minds, a structure built to convey clarity, logic, and understanding. But what happens when a sentence defies its own purpose? What happens when meaning becomes a Mobius strip, endlessly twisting inward? The liar's paradox is not just a clever word game. It's a gaping hole in the fabric of truth itself. I'm lying. That's the heartbeat of the paradox. 4 words, infinitely sharp. If I'm lying, then I'm telling the truth, which means I'm lying, which means I'm telling the truth. It doesn't stop. It cannot stop. It's a sentence that eats itself like an Ouroboros, devouring its own tail in a loop of logical suicide. Yet it doesn't die. It persists, refusing to let you walk away with certainty. You think you understand it, and then it laughs in your face. How do we define truth in a world where some statements cannot be assigned a truth value? This isn't just an inconvenience. It's a philosophical and mathematical crisis. The liar's paradox shook the very foundations of logic, inspiring entire branches of modern thought, from Gödel's incompleteness theorems to Turing's halting problem, all from one simple, broken sentence. It challenges the binary code of our cognition, true or false, yes or no, 0 or 1. But the liar's paradox stands in the middle and says, both, neither, not now, not ever. What does that do to your brain, to your trust in reason? And what does it say about our universe that such a sentence can even exist? This isn't just a linguistic trick. It's a crack in the mirror of rationality. A reminder that there are limits to what we can know, say, prove, or even believe. Imagine a courtroom where a witness stands and says, "Everything I say from now on is a lie." How do we proceed? Is the next thing they say false? But then the first statement would have to be true, making it false. The justice system runs on assumptions of truthfulness, coherence, narrative. The liar's paradox pulls the rug out from under all of it. Imagine a mind that thinks about itself, that says, "I cannot be trusted," then asks, "But if I cannot be trusted, is even this doubt trustworthy?" Isn't that what happens in depression, in anxiety, in spiraling doubt? Your brain becomes the liar, and your attempts to catch it become the paradox. You are both the detective and the suspect, the whisper and the scream, the claim and the contradiction. There's something devastatingly human about this paradox. It reveals the vulnerability of self-reference, the fragility of introspection, the danger of turning thought inward too sharply. When a system tries to define itself completely from within, it stumbles into incoherence. This is what Gödel proved. Mathematically, in any logical system rich enough to describe arithmetic, there will be truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. In other words, there will always be statements that stand outside our reach, mocking our attempts to pin them down. Is that not a metaphor for consciousness? We are aware of ourselves. We speak of ourselves. We try to describe ourselves. But what if the very act of doing so creates the paradox? What if the self that says, "I know myself," is the same self it's trying to know? We are like mirrors, trying to reflect themselves, like a book trying to read itself, like a sentence that declares itself a lie. And the deeper we look, the more the meaning frays. So we laugh. We turn it into a joke. We call it a puzzle, a curiosity. But it's more than that. It's a reminder that meaning is not a solid thing. That language, our most trusted tool, is built on foundations that can collapse under pressure. That logic, for all its elegance, can still encounter ghosts, and still, we use it. We speak, we write, we confess. We say things like, "I'll never lie to you," or "This is the truth." But how do we know we're not just walking paradoxes? When someone says, "Trust me," do you? What if they add, "I always lie"? What happens to relationships, to philosophy, to reality itself when trust becomes a loop? The liar's paradox forces us to consider that maybe some questions don't have answers. That maybe the quest for perfect truth is itself a lie. Or maybe it's the only truth that matters. And so, we live in uncertainty. We stand before the paradox and neither resolve it nor walk away. We feel it like a splinter in the brain, not meant to kill us, just to remind us that the mind is a wilderness, that some paths lead nowhere, and that sometimes meaning isn't the destination, it's the question. Or maybe that's just another lie. Ship of Theseus. Imagine this. A ship, once sailed by a legendary hero, rests in a quiet harbor. For centuries, it has been preserved with reverence. But time, as always, is relentless. A plank rots, so they replace it. A sail tears, so they sew a new one. A mast cracks, so they craft another. Slowly, piece by piece, the ship is maintained, not through neglect, but through love, until one day, not a single original part remains. And yet, there it is, still called the Ship of Theseus. You stand before it, gazing at its polished deck, its sturdy hull, its gleaming oars. It looks as it always has. But is it still the same ship? Or is it something else entirely? An imposter wearing the skin of memory? The paradox tightens its grip like a silent undertow. If identity can survive complete transformation, what then is identity? If a thing can lose all its substance and still be considered itself, are we worshipping its form, or simply the idea of it? And what about you? When your childhood cells died and were replaced, when your beliefs shattered and reformed, when your name stayed the same, but your mind fractured into versions that barely recognize each other, did you remain you, or did someone else take your place, plank by plank, thought by thought? The ship of Theseus is not merely a fable about a boat. It is a slow-burning question about the essence of continuity. It pulls apart the threads that hold our sense of self, memory, legacy, even love, together. And it asks, cruelly, quietly, what does it mean to remain? There's a second layer, more haunting still. Imagine this. Somewhere in a forgotten yard, a collector has been gathering each original piece of Theseus's ship. The rotten planks, the snapped mast, the torn sail, each carefully restored and reassembled. It takes years, decades. But at last, a ship emerges, reconstructed from the very components Theseus once touched. Now there are two ships, one in the harbour, gleaming and intact, but made of replacements. The other, rougher, older, but built from the original parts. So which one is the real ship of Theseus? The polished imposter, or the resurrected corpse? Can identity be divorced from substance, or from continuity, or from function? And can two things, separate, complete, and contradictory, both be the same? We want the world to be neat. We want to assign names and watch them behave. We want the comfort of permanence. But identity doesn't obey our desires. It slips through definitions like mist. Think of language. A word remains the same while its meaning shifts with time. Awful once meant awe-inspiring. Now it means something wretched. The sound is identical. The meaning is not. Is the word still itself? Think of love. The person you fell for years ago has changed, grown, evolved. You have too. But the relationship endures, at least in name. Is it still the same love, or merely a continuity of memory binding different people together? Think of the self. The face in your mirror bears traces of the past, but time has etched its edits. Your laugh isn't quite the same. Your hopes have shrunk or expanded. You forget things that once felt central to your being. So what remains? What part of you is not replaced? We walk around calling ourselves by the same name we did at 6, 16, 26, as though time didn't sandpaper our souls. We trust in a narrative of selfhood. But is it a truth or just a convenient illusion? There's a pain in this question, an ache, because we long for permanence in a world that only knows flux. The ship of Theseus whispers to us that nothing is truly stable. Not ships, not identities, not even memory. It warns us that what we love may not be what it seems, that what we mourn may not be lost, that the boundaries between real and replica are much blurrier than we're comfortable admitting, and yet we build our lives on such boundaries. A family home is sold and renovated, and yet it remains home in the stories. A digital photo is filtered, compressed, re-edited, and still it is the same memory. A friend drifts away, then returns years later with a new voice, a new worldview, but we still call them friend. Maybe what matters isn't the substance, but the thread. The invisible thread of continuity, the function, the role, the emotional tether. Or maybe it's all fiction. Stories we tell ourselves to endure the unbearable flow of change. Let's return to the ships, two vessels, one original in body, the other in spirit. Which do we choose? The one that Theseus might recognize by touch, or the one that carried his name forward through time? Does memory define identity, or does functionality? If a violin once owned by Mozart is rebuilt from new wood, but still plays his music, does it matter? And if your mind forgets who you were, but your body continues to act, to smile, to mourn, what survives? What if, after a trauma, you emerge with a different worldview, a different capacity for joy, A new language of pain. Do your old friends still know you? Do you know yourself? The ship of Theseus dares to ask, is there anything in this world that cannot be replaced? Not physically, but essentially. It brings you face to face with the terrifying possibility that you might be a story held together by memory, habit, and name. And if any of those cracks, what is left? It's a philosophical problem, but it's also personal, because we lose people slowly. We lose them to time, to age, to ideology, to distance. We watch them change plank by plank until one day we're not sure what remains. Sometimes we change too and feel ourselves become strangers in our own lives. And yet, somehow, we keep sailing. Perhaps the ship of Theseus doesn't answer the question of identity. Perhaps it teaches us to live with the uncertainty, to love what shifts, to mourn what changes, to forgive what doesn't last, to honor the thread, even when the planks are gone. Because maybe identity isn't found in the parts, but in the journey, in the wind in the sails, in the salt on the skin, in the hands that steer. Maybe the ship of Theseus is real, not because of what it's made of, but because it keeps going. And maybe that's all we can ever do. Dichotomy. Paradoxe. Imagine this. A man stands at the start of a road. Just a simple path stretching ahead, silent, sunlit, clear. His destination is visible in the distance, a tall tree swaying gently in the breeze. He lifts his foot and prepares to walk. But before he can take his first step, a voice whispers from within, "To reach the tree, you must first reach the halfway point." That seems fair. So he moves forward, reaching the midpoint. But then the voice returns. Before you reach that halfway mark, you must first reach the halfway point of that. And so he does, and again, and again. Every step is halved, every distance divided. There is always another fraction to cross, another threshold, smaller than the last. No matter how far he walks, no matter how closely he approaches the tree, he never actually arrives. The space between him and his destination becomes a hall of mirrors, each step reflecting a new step that must come before it. So he stands there, infinitely close, infinitely far. What does it mean to move forward if motion is just an endless series of beginnings? Zeno of Elea, a philosopher from the 5th century BCE, introduced this disturbing puzzle. It has since unsettled minds from Aristotle to Newton to Gödel. It is known as the dichotomy paradox, the idea that to move any distance, one must first traverse an infinite number of smaller distances. But if completing an infinite number of tasks is impossible, then how do we move at all? The paradox slices into the very heart of motion, time, and continuity. It exposes a gap between logic and experience, between what seems real and what we know. We move every day, we walk, we run, we fall. And yet, according to this paradox, we should be frozen in place, forever preparing to begin. What is movement, then? An illusion? A dream stitched together by perception? Or is logic itself a flawed lens through which we try to observe the messy, trembling world? There is something eerily familiar in the paradox. You don't have to be a mathematician to feel it. How often have you stood before a goal, within reach, and felt it stretch endlessly ahead? How many times have you told yourself, "I'll start when I'm ready," only to discover that ready always has another layer, another task, another prerequisite? You say you'll write the novel, after a few notes, after an outline, after a course, after inspiration. You say you'll forgive someone, once the pain softens, once the apology comes, once you understand. You say you'll become who you are meant to be, once this phase ends, once the fear fades, once everything aligns. Each time you approach the moment, each time a smaller moment appears before it, and each time you divide again. So what if the man in the paradox isn't walking toward a tree? What if he's walking toward healing, or honesty, or love? What if the infinite steps aren't physical, but emotional? the countless internal milestones we demand of ourselves before we allow transformation to happen. We crave clarity. We crave finality. But Zeno's paradox reveals a world built not on absolutes, but on infinities. You want to arrive. But what if there is no there? Just an unending path of almost. What if every version of yourself is a midpoint, not a destination? What if time itself is not a river, but a series of droplets, each moment suspended, each one needing to be crossed endlessly? It's a paradox that haunts the architecture of thought, because at its core, it doesn't just question motion, it questions completion. If every task can be divided into smaller tasks, when is anything ever done? When is a thought finished? When is love whole? When is grief complete? If every breath is built from smaller breaths, when have we truly breathed? There's a peculiar comfort in the paradox too, for those who learn to sit inside its impossible logic. Because if the journey is made of infinite steps, then you're always on the way. There's no shame in being incomplete, no guilt in progress, no pressure to arrive. The tree will remain on the horizon, and you will walk. That is enough. The danger is only in believing the illusion that arrival is a singular moment, that one final step ends the path. But what if every step is an arrival in disguise? What if the halfway mark is the destination? There's a hidden irony in the dichotomy paradox. While it argues that motion is impossible, it exists within a world where motion is undeniably real. We move, we touch, we kiss, we fall down, and yet the logic of the paradox still holds. So what breaks? The mind or the world? Is there a flaw in perception or a flaw in logic? Is math too precise for the chaos of existence? Or is it exposing a truth too raw for us to face? We live as if the world is whole, but we think in fragments. Our memories are patchworks. Our bodies are collections of cells dividing. Our identities are mosaics of selves we used to be. What is a person but an infinite series of changes? And so the paradox bleeds beyond philosophy, into psychology, into identity. You may feel stuck, not because you aren't moving, but because your concept of movement is flawed. You may be changing, slowly, silently, and dismissing it because you're still not there yet. But maybe there doesn't exist. Maybe all that exists is the walk. It's tempting to seek resolution, to declare, calculus solves this. Motion happens because the sum of an infinite number of diminishing intervals can be finite. And mathematically, that's correct. The paradox has been resolved, they say. But has it? Does solving the numbers erase the emotional weight of the idea? Because in the silence between equations, the paradox still whispers, you're not quite there yet. You're never quite enough. There's always one more thing to do. One more layer. One more inch. And sometimes that whisper is louder than the truth. So imagine the man again. He hears the voice. He divides the path. He hesitates. But then he walks. Not because the logic permits it. Not because he understands how. But because the tree is beautiful and the path is calling. And sometimes you must act in defiance of reason just to be alive. Maybe the paradox isn't meant to be solved, but survived. Maybe it's a mirror we're meant to walk past, not stare into. Maybe the infinite steps are not a prison, but a dance. And maybe, just maybe, motion is not a matter of logic, but of faith. Barber paradoxe. Imagine this, a village carved in quiet symmetry. Stone roads spiral inward toward a town square where silence hangs like mist. No honking cars, no digital buzz, just the soft echoes of footfalls and morning chatter. And in this village lives a barber, not just any barber. This one is peculiar, bound by a curious rule. He shaves every man in the village who does not shave himself, and only those men. He takes his craft seriously. He is methodical, precise, governed not by whim, but by logic. The villagers trust him. He's clean, he's quick, and above all, he's consistent. If you shave yourself, he'll never touch your beard. If you don't, he'll be there every week. But one quiet afternoon, when the barber is sharpening his razor beneath a waning sun, he stops. Something uncoils in his mind, like a knot loosening. An absurd, impossible question. Does he shave himself? If he does, then by rule, he should not. If he doesn't, then he must. The blade in his hand trembles, not from fear, but from the weight of contradiction. And suddenly, the whole world feels broken. The barber paradoxe, posed by logician and philosopher Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century, appears simple on its surface, almost playful. Yet it holds within it a black hole of contradiction that swallows logic itself. It is a question that cannot be answered, a riddle that breaks the very rules it tries to follow. And like all true paradoxes, it's not just about barbers or beards. It's about self-reference, about the danger of a system that tries to contain itself, about what happens when a rule turns inward and demands an answer from the very thing it's supposed to govern. Can a system define itself without unraveling? Can a man, governed by logic, ever be free? To live is to build boundaries. We create identities, rules, categories. We say, this is who I am, or that is not me. And often we do so with certainty, placing ourselves inside systems of belief, language, society. We say, these are the conditions, and we live by them, until, one day, something shifts. A mirror reflects another mirror. A question is asked by the one who answers, a rule applies to the one who wrote it, and everything folds. Have you ever felt it? The moment you tried to understand yourself through, the lens you used to understand the world, and it cracked. The instant you asked, who am I when I'm not performing? Or, what do I believe when I stop repeating what I've been told? Or worse, what does it mean to love myself when I am the one hurting me? The barber paradoxe is not just a logical curiosity, it is an existential wound, a silent scream hidden in a tidy formulation. It asks, can you be both subject and object? Can you hold the blade and feel its cut at once? The barber's dilemma mirrors something buried deep in human consciousness. The hunger to define truth from within truth. It is the soul trying to see itself without using a mirror. The heart trying to measure its own beats. You say, I know myself. But who is the I that knows? And who is the self that is known? If they are the same, then the loop has no anchor. If they are different, then which one is you? The paradox bleeds into ethics too. Can a society legislate morality if the law itself is made by flawed people? Can we trust our own judgment if that judgment is built on years of inherited bias? And more intimately, can you forgive yourself for what you did when the one who needs forgiveness is also the one who must give it? There's a subtle horror to this paradox. Not the horror of blood or darkness, but the horror of collapse. The collapse of structure, of certainty, of language itself. Because if logic can contradict itself, then nothing is safe. And yet, paradoxes, like this, aren't flaws in reality. They are symptoms of its complexity. Russell didn't just stumble into a trap. He uncovered a fault line in the foundations of logic, a crack that would later shake mathematics, philosophy, and even computer science. Because if we cannot define something from within its own terms, how do we define anything? The barber cannot shave himself without violating the rule, but the rule only exists because of him. The loop is infinite, and the only way out is to break the system. In therapy, this paradox re-emerges as a silent guest. A patient says, I feel broken, and the therapist asks, who says so? The answer, of course, is the patient. But if you are broken, how can you trust your own assessment? The mind becomes both judge and criminal, healer and wound. Can the self heal itself? Can the liar tell the truth about their own lies? You reach a point where the only path forward is not resolution, but surrender. You stop asking the question not because it has been answered, but because you realize it cannot be. And in that silence, something else begins. The barber, perhaps, puts down his razor, not in despair, but in humility. He walks outside, leaving the tidy frame of logic behind, and watches the sun flicker against the rooftops. Maybe he smiles, realizing that some questions are not meant to be solved, but felt, lived, breathed, abandoned. He still shaves the villagers. But when they ask, "Do you shave yourself?" he just says, "It depends on the day." Maybe that's what the paradox is for, not to trap us, but to remind us that not everything must fit, that systems break, rules fray, identities slip. And sometimes, the only honest response to a question is a pause. What if your contradictions are not flaws, but invitations? What if being a paradox is not a failure of logic, but a sign of life? What if the barber is not a prisoner, but a mirror? And what if, deep down, so are you, paradox of choice? Imagine this. You walk into a quiet cafe, seeking nothing more than a warm drink and a moment of stillness. The barista smiles and gestures to the massive board above her head. 24 types of coffee. Not just latte or espresso. No, it's oat milk, soy milk, almond, single origin, triple shot, caramel swirl, sugar-free vanilla, cold brew aged with citrus peels. And beside each name, an elaborate description, as if each cup holds a secret life story. You hesitate, not because you dislike coffee. You love it, but your hands grow colder the longer you stand, eyes darting. A quiet pressure settles in your chest, because beneath all that variety, a strange question claws its way to the surface of your mind. What if I make the wrong choice? You came looking for comfort. You found paralysis, and you're not alone. This is the paradox of choice, a modern riddle with ancient roots, a phenomenon where having more options doesn't lead to more freedom, but more fear, where choice, instead of being a symbol of liberation, becomes a slow, silent thief of peace. What if freedom isn't in choosing, but in choosing less? What if every option we add is a mirror reflecting who we are not? In a world obsessed with freedom, choice is sacred. It's a moral currency, a proof of progress. We tell ourselves, you can be anyone, do anything, live anywhere, love anyone, swipe, click, buy, cancel, infinite access. But with every door that opens, there's another that closes. And the more doors we see, the louder the silence behind the ones we didn't walk through. In theory, having options should empower us. In reality, it often buries us beneath an avalanche of self-doubt. You scroll through endless movie titles on a streaming service. 45 minutes later, you're still watching trailers. You end up re-watching something familiar, not because it's the best, but because the weight of choosing drained you. You sit across from someone you care about, unsure whether you want a relationship. You've read articles, taken quizzes, spoken to friends, but you can't decide. Because love isn't the only option anymore. There's self-love, freedom, healing, the single life, spiritual growth, and so you float. Not because you don't care, but because your heart is torn between paths you never had to consider before. This is the irony. We believe more choice brings more happiness, but often it brings more regret. The more options we see, the higher our expectations rise. We no longer want a good outcome, we want the best. And when things fall short of that, imagined ideal, the dissatisfaction doesn't come from what we got, but from what we didn't. A missed flavor, a better deal, a life unlived. Have you ever bought something after hours of comparison shopping, only to feel disappointed as soon as it arrives? Not because the item is bad, but because you made the choice, and it wasn't perfect. We carry the burden of authorship, and with it, the sting of blame. There's a cruel elegance to how this paradox unfolds. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It slips into your joy, your freedom, your little moments of autonomy, and casts shadows. You leave a job because there are better ones out there. You leave a city because you wonder who you'd be elsewhere. You leave a person because, somewhere deep in the digital ocean, another person might be more aligned. But every exit leaves an echo, and at some point, you stop moving forward because you're called by desire. You move because you're haunted by doubt. In ancient times, humans lived in constraint. We were born into tribes, crafts, beliefs. You became the blacksmith your father was. You married someone from the village. Life was narrower, but it was clear. Your identity wasn't a thing you chose. It was handed to you. Now identity is a buffet. We pick our labels. We craft our image. We try on dreams like outfits. And while this sounds like progress, it also leads to fragmentation. Because how do you build a self when that self can change at every click? How do you find your path when every path is open? You become like a river without banks. Fluid, yes, but uncontained. Is that freedom? Or is it a slow erosion of meaning? Sometimes, the suffering isn't in making the choice. It's in knowing that no matter what you choose, you will lose something. Not necessarily something worse, but something different. And we are terrible at mourning the unlived life. We make a choice and secretly carry the ghost of the other option in our pockets. You marry someone, but you wonder what the mountain-loving, guitar-playing stranger from 5 years ago is doing now. You choose one career, but dream about the art you never pursued, and so the mind splits. Part of you moves forward. Part of you lingers, from someone you care about, unsure whether you want a relationship. You've read articles, taken quizzes, spoken to friends, but you can't decide. Because love isn't the only option anymore. There's self-love, freedom, healing, the single life, spiritual growth, and so you float. Not because you don't care, but because your heart is torn between paths you never had to consider before. What if the true enemy of happiness isn't limitation, but expectation? When you have fewer choices, you learn to find meaning in what is. You deepen, you commit, you adapt. But when you have infinite options, you start to believe that satisfaction must be perfect, that every moment should be maximized, that there's a best possible outcome, and you alone are responsible for finding it. It's a cruel theology, because perfection doesn't exist, and chasing it doesn't elevate you. It hollows you. Bootstrap paradoxe. Imagine this. You're sitting alone in a dusty attic, surrounded by yellowed newspapers, brittle with age. You find an old, unmarked book lying beneath a torn cloth. You blow off the dust. Its pages are filled with schematics, strange equations, pages upon pages of precise engineering designs. You study them. Somehow they make sense. You replicate the machine they describe. Years later, it works. A time machine. But here's the twist. You travel back, book in hand, and meet a younger version of yourself. You hand it to them, the same book that once sat forgotten in your attic. They take it, study it, and years later build the machine. Then they go back in time and hand the book to you again. No one ever wrote the book. No one ever created its content. The knowledge exists in an endless loop, a perfect circle with no beginning, no origin. It just is. Where did the book come from? Who is the author? Who birthed the knowledge, or does the knowledge exist outside causality itself? This is the bootstrap paradoxe, a wound in time that doesn't bleed, but loops. A scenario where cause and effect eat each other like serpents locked in an eternal kiss of confusion. And it doesn't just break the laws of narrative. It gnaws at the foundations of identity, creativity, authorship, and existence. Because if something can exist without a point of origin, what does that say about us? The paradox is named after the idea of pulling oneself up by their own bootstraps. An impossible task. A humorous idiom twisted into something existentially horrifying. It emerges in the fabric of time travel stories, but its echo resonates far beyond fiction. It haunts physics. It teases philosophers. It lingers like a riddle in the hallways of consciousness. The scenario is simple, but its implications are vast. Imagine a composer who is given a sheet of music by an old stranger. Years later, the composer becomes the stranger, travels back in time, and gives their younger self the same music. Who composed it? Was it ever truly composed? Or is it a ghost of information traveling through time, never born, never dying? A melody without a muse. A book without an author. A thought without a thinker. Think for a moment about memory, about stories, about culture. Where do your ideas come from? Where do your dreams originate? We inherit language, myths, algorithms of thought. But what if, somewhere in the quiet corners of time, a piece of knowledge escaped the causal chain? What if someone learned something not from observation, not from experience, but from a future that hasn't happened yet? Would it still be their idea? Or would they just be carriers of echoes? And what about you? How much of what you believe, desire, or create is truly yours? The bootstrap paradox is terrifying, not because it's hard to understand, but because it's so clean, so perfect. Unlike the messy confusion of most paradoxes, it presents a seamless loop, smooth, logical, inescapable. And in that perfection lies the horror. We rely on beginnings, on seeds, on creation. We trace back inventions to inventors. We believe in a first cause, a prime mover. Everything must come from something, but the paradox mocks that. It invites us to imagine a universe where certain things just appear. Looping. Unanchored. Reality cannibalizing itself. And if information can do that, if a blueprint, a song, a story can come from nowhere, what about the self? What about you? You think you are the product of your past. Childhood moments, words spoken, books read, mistakes made. But what if that's a comforting illusion? What if your sense of identity is nothing more than a loop, a closed feedback of reactions and narratives with no first cause? What if the origin of who you are cannot be found in time, but outside it? And if it's outside time, can it ever be understood? Or are you simply the echo of an echo? The mind hates originless loops. It seeks meaning in beginnings. We celebrate birthdays. We love how it all started stories. Our mythologies are full of Genesis tales, from divine creation to cosmic explosions. Even scientific theories crave beginnings. First molecules, first cells, first sparks. But the bootstrap paradox takes that yearning and stares into its eyes like a mirror. It dares you to find the start. It dares you to locate the thread's end. And as you search, you realize the thread coils inward, endlessly. Not tangled, but recursive. You do not find answers. You find yourself. And maybe that's the most disorienting discovery of all. There is something haunting about the idea that time may not be linear, but a spiral. That our lives may not be a straight path, but a closed circuit with illusions of choice, of cause, of change. If someone in the future hands you a gift, a tool, a word, a truth, and you carry it backward to yourself, did you ever learn it? Or were you always meant to carry it? Is destiny just causality with a curved spine? And if so, what is freedom? If we are caught in a loop of events we can neither trace nor escape, how do we live? How do we choose? Here's a more terrifying thought. What if the universe itself is a bootstrap loop? What if the particles that make stars are born not from an external explosion, but from a recursive process that contains its own origin? What if the laws of physics weren't discovered, but handed to us from ourselves? A cosmos that birthed itself, a godless god, a melody that hums itself into existence. And in quieter moments, the paradox slips into your daily life. You think of a line, you write it down. A friend reads it and says, "That reminds me of something I once told you." You don't remember. You think you've had a new idea, but maybe you've just recycled a forgotten phrase. A mental time loop, a cognitive bootstrap. Creation becomes transmission. Inspiration becomes repetition. Authorship fades. What then is originality? Is it a spark, or a shadow, a beginning, or a loop you haven't recognized yet? The bootstrap. Paradox doesn't break reality. It warps it just enough to make you question everything. It's not loud, it doesn't scream. It whispers in clean loops, elegant circles. It invites you to imagine a world where effect is cause, where the snake eats its tail, not in tragedy, but in inevitability. And in that world, meaning isn't lost, but inverted. It's not about where something came from. It's about how long you can hold it before you must pass it on again. Not because you understand it, but because the loop demands it. Imagine this. One day, you wake to find a letter on your doorstep. There's no return address. Inside are instructions. You follow them. They change your life. Years later, you write that same letter, word for word, and leave it on the doorstep of your younger self. The pen shakes in your hand, not from fear, but from the echo. Because you realize you never wrote the letter. You were only the messenger. And that, somehow, is enough. And in quieter moments, the paradox slips into your daily life. You think of a line. You write it down. A friend reads it and says, "That reminds me of something I once told you." You don't remember. You think you've had a new idea, but maybe you've just recycled a forgotten phrase. A mental time loop, a cognitive bootstrap. Creation becomes transmission. Inspiration becomes repetition. Authorship fades. What then is originality? Is it a spark, or a shadow, a beginning, or a loop you haven't recognized yet? The bootstrap. Paradox doesn't break reality. It warps it just enough to make you question everything. It's not loud, it doesn't scream. It whispers in clean loops, elegant circles. It invites you to imagine a world where effect is cause, where the snake eats its tail, not in tragedy, but in inevitability. And in that world, meaning isn't lost, but inverted. It's not about where something came from. It's about how long you can hold it before you must pass it on again. Not because you understand it, but because the loop demands it. Imagine this. One day, you wake to find a letter on your doorstep. There's no return address. Inside are instructions. You follow them. They change your life. Years later, you write that same letter, word for word, and leave it on the doorstep of your younger self. The pen shakes in your hand, not from fear, but from the echo. Because you realize you never wrote the letter. You were only the messenger. And that, somehow, is enough. It begins innocently, almost playfully. Take a heap of sand. Remove a grain. It's still a heap, right? Remove another. Still a heap. Again, again, again. Until finally, there's only a single grain. When did the heap stop being a heap? Was it grain number 9,143, or was 17, or 1-1? The paradox doesn't mock your logic, it exposes it. Exposes how fragile our categories are, how much of our reality is built not on absolutes, but thresholds we can never define. We live our lives in these grey zones, heaps that aren't heaps, old age that isn't sudden, love that fades by degrees, identities that shift so gradually we barely notice. What if nothing ever truly changes? What if everything simply slips? Now imagine someone falling out of love, not in a moment of passion or betrayal. No explosion, no epiphany, just a slow erosion. One glance that doesn't linger, one touch that feels more habitual than intimate. One evening when silence replaces curiosity. Day by day, grain by grain, the heap of love diminishes. But which moment was the end? Was it the last "I love you" spoken out of routine? Was it the night they preferred sleep over conversation, or was it weeks before, when you laughed and they didn't? The sorite's paradox does not only dwell in sand and logic, it lives in hearts. It lives in time. It lives in the subtle cruelties of imperceptible loss. We crave clear lines. Child versus adult, rich versus poor, happy versus depressed, alive versus dead. But reality doesn't honor those categories. Reality drips. It slides. It flows. A person doesn't become wealthy the moment they earn their millionth dollar. A child doesn't become an adult at the stroke of midnight on their 18th birthday. A soul doesn't fall into despair because of a single sorrow. And yet, we act as if they do because we need thresholds. They give us control. They let us name the world, draw boundaries, build ethics, laws, societies. But what if those boundaries are illusions? What if we are constantly mistaking gradualism for stability? The sorite's paradox sits at the dinner table when a man takes his first sip of wine, convinced he'll only drink one glass. Grain one. A second glass follows. Then another. Eventually, he's a drunk. But he never made a decision to become one. He simply did not stop. And therein lies the tragedy. Sometimes destruction is not the product of intent, but accumulation. You don't decide to ruin yourself. You just don't notice when you began. Ask yourself, how many lies does it take to become a liar? How many moments of cowardice to become a coward? How many compromises before you've abandoned your values? 1, 10, 1,000? And what if you never crossed the line because there was no line? What if you are already what you feared becoming, and the only reason you don't see it is because the change was too small to notice each time? What if every grain you've excused has already buried you? The sorite's paradox haunts language too. What is tall? What is bold? What is fast? What is enough? These aren't answers. They're guesses we agree upon. Loose consensus dressed as clarity. A man may be bald with 300 hairs, or 3,000, depending on who you ask. A woman may be successful by some standards, but barely getting by according to her own. The paradox asks us to admit much of our certainty is social theatre. We nod and pretend we agree on terms, while deep down we're unsure where the line even lies. And that uncertainty gnaws at us. Because how can we live authentically if the words we live by, truth, love, courage, integrity, are all heaps in disguise? There's a strange comfort in believing that change happens in moments, in turning points, in grand finales and sharp beginnings. It gives us stories. It gives us closure. But the sorite's paradox quietly shatters that comfort. It whispers, there are no turning points, only thresholds you didn't notice crossing. You didn't become bitter in one heartbreak. You didn't lose your creativity in a single rejection. You didn't stop dreaming because of one bad year. You let go of the dream one day at a time, in small negotiations. You stopped sketching, then writing, then imagining. You became tired, then numb, then practical. And one day you woke up wondering, where did the dream go? You looked for a moment, a grain, but you couldn't find it. Because there was no grain, only the illusion of one. This is why the sorite's paradox is not just a puzzle, it is a mirror. It shows us that identity is not a statue carved, but sand shaped by the tide. You are not who you were yesterday, but you're not that person either. You are a continuum, a slow bloom, or a quiet decay. And depending on how you live, depending on the grains you add or subtract each day, you are either becoming more you or slowly forgetting what that even meant. So what do we do with this paradox? Do we give up on categories, abandon words like heap, truth, change, and personhood? Or do we embrace their fluidity? Do we stop asking when the shift happened and start asking why we need to know? Maybe the lesson isn't to draw sharper lines, but to pay attention to the grains, to every moment of kindness, every small lie, every quiet choice, to treat every grain as sacred, not because it will define the heap, but because it already is the heap. You are not waiting to become someone. You already are. You just haven't noticed how much sand you've gathered or lost. Imagine this. One day you wake up and realize you haven't laughed in a while. Not really. You scroll through photos, journals, memories. You can't pinpoint the moment joy left, but you know it has. And then you remember the sorties paradoxe, not as a thought experiment, but as a warning. Because it never was about heaps of sand. It was always about you. Unexpected exam. Paradoxe. Imagine this. The day has arrived. The exam that you've been preparing for, studying day and night, memorizing notes, practicing problems, has finally come. You're at your desk, staring at the paper in front of you. The clock ticks away with its usual cruel detachment, yet something is wrong. A strange sensation begins to crawl over your mind. As you read through the first question, you realize with a growing sense of panic that it feels unfamiliar. This isn't what you studied. You turn to the next question, the same feeling. Nothing looks right. Your mind, which was certain just hours ago, starts to unravel. You glance at the clock. Minutes slip away like sand through your fingers, but the questions on the page mock you with their distance. How could this be? I studied everything, you think. The material is so fresh in your mind, yet none of it seems to fit this exam. You've become entangled in a dilemma, a paradox of sorts. You've prepared, but you can't apply your preparation. You know everything, yet nothing seems to help. This moment, this experience, embodies the unexpected exam paradox. At first glance, this situation seems all too familiar. The paradox lies in the irony of preparation itself. We invest countless hours, energy, and focus into becoming experts in a subject, only to find that when it truly matters, the knowledge we've worked so hard to accumulate doesn't seem to be enough. We encounter questions that test not just our understanding of the material, but our ability to adapt and apply what we've learned in ways that feel entirely outside of our control. In other words, no matter how much we prepare, the exam sometimes feels like an unpredictable monster, shifting and changing in ways we weren't ready for. This paradox is not simply about failing an exam. It's about the overwhelming dissonance between the way we expect things to unfold and the chaos that can ensue in moments of pressure. Why does it seem that after all the preparation, the mind can become so disoriented? Why do we often find ourselves at the mercy of questions we've technically mastered, yet can't answer when the stakes are high? What if preparation itself is not the answer? What if the very act of preparing for something, of anticipating its arrival, conditions us to fail in the moment of truth? The knowledge trap. Preparation or over-preparation. Consider the concept of preparation. We are told that the key to success is preparation. This is drilled into us from a young age, whether by teachers, parents, or mentors. Study hard, and you'll be ready, they say. Success comes to those who prepare. We internalize this lesson, shaping our worldview around it. We believe that if we put in the time and effort, we will triumph. But here's the first twist. The more we prepare, the more we begin to overthink. The very act of over-preparing can lead to confusion rather than clarity. We tend to think of preparation as a linear path. Study harder, study longer, and success will follow. But this approach assumes that the act of preparing creates a perfect blueprint, one that will always function correctly when tested. It assumes that we can predict every scenario and master every possibility. However, life and exams are rarely predictable. The more we prepare, the more our minds become consumed with the intricacies of potential outcomes. We find ourselves trapped in a cycle of self-doubt. What if this question is different from what I studied? What if I misunderstood the material? What if I forgot something crucial? The very abundance of possibilities creates a mental fog that clouds our clarity. Here lies the paradox. The more we know, the more we risk losing touch with the essential. The exam isn't just a test of knowledge, it's a test of our ability to adapt, to be flexible with what we know, and to think on our feet. And when we've over-prepared, we begin to freeze in the face of uncertainty. It's as if we have been armed with a vast arsenal of knowledge, but in the moment of battle, we become paralyzed by our inability to know exactly which weapon to choose. The very choice we have in front of us, the ability to navigate the knowledge we have, is what betrays us. The fear of the unknown. Now, consider this. It's not the knowledge we lack, but the certainty of its application. When we step into the exam room, we are flooded with uncertainty. What we don't know isn't what's on the page. It's the way the question might be framed, the angle from which it may be approached, or the demand it might place on our creativity or intuition. It's this fear of the unknown, the fear that we might encounter something that doesn't fit neatly into the framework we've built, that causes us to falter. This is the unexpected nature of the exam. It doesn't simply test our retention, but our readiness for something that might be outside the boundaries of our expectations. And that is a terrifying prospect. The mind wants control. We want to know that all our hours of study will be rewarded with predictable results. But the paradox of choice here is that the more options we have, the more information we accumulate, the harder it becomes to trust ourselves and our ability to handle the unknown. In some ways, the paradox of the unexpected exam is that it forces us to confront a deeper truth. We are never fully prepared for everything. No amount of studying, no matter how exhaustive, can ever guarantee that we will be able to predict or handle every challenge that comes our way. This unsettling realization can cause anxiety, but it also brings with it a lesson. The key to success is not imperfect preparation, but imperfect adaptability. The ability to embrace the unknown, to trust that we can figure things out when faced with the unexpected, is what makes us truly resilient. The existential weight of certainty. At the heart of this paradox lies an existential tension, the constant struggle between certainty and uncertainty. We are creatures of certainty, and yet we live in a world defined by unpredictability. The paradox of the unexpected exam mirrors the broader human condition, our desire for control over the uncontrollable, our need for answers in a world that often leaves us with more questions. Imagine being in that exam room again. You've read the first question, and now you face the second. The material you've studied is there, somewhere in your mind, but it's no longer enough. The question forces you to go beyond the boundaries of your knowledge, to stretch your thinking in ways you weren't prepared for. You feel the weight of your preparation on your shoulders, yet it's no longer a source of confidence. Instead, it's a source of doubt. Is this the real test? Is it about the specific knowledge on the page, or is it about our ability to confront the unknown without crumbling? The paradox is that the act of preparation itself, the very thing we believe will protect us, ends up being the thing that undermines us when we need it most. It's an uncomfortable realization, but one that is deeply human. We build our lives around the illusion of control, but the truth is that we are constantly living in a world where uncertainty rules. The unexpected exam is not just a theoretical problem, it's a metaphor for the challenges we face daily. The moments when what we know falls short, and we must improvise, adapt, and innovate in real time. Conclusion. So, what do we take away from this paradox? That maybe, just maybe, we need to rethink the way we approach preparation. Perhaps the key isn't in memorizing more facts or anticipating every possibility, but in cultivating a mindset that can handle the unpredictable. The unexpected exam, like life itself, isn't just about what we know, it's about how we respond when the unexpected strikes. The next time you prepare for a challenge, whether it's an exam, a project, or any life event, ask yourself this: am I preparing for every possible outcome, or am I preparing myself to remain flexible in the face of the unknown? After all, what truly matters isn't knowing everything. It's knowing that, whatever happens, you'll find a way to move forward. Hempel paradoxe. Imagine this. You stand at the edge of a great, endless expanse. Before you, stretching as far as the eye can see, is a river, smooth and silent like a mirror. The water is perfectly still, and yet, deep within its depths, you know that it is rushing, swirling, and moving at an incomprehensible speed. There's something unsettling about it. The stillness doesn't match what you know to be true. But how can this be? How can the surface remain so calm while the currents rage below? Now imagine you are asked to explain this phenomenon, to give an account of the river's behavior. It seems straightforward. If the surface is calm, then the river must be calm, right? But then there's a contradiction. You know the current is there, deep within the water, but it is entirely invisible to the naked eye. You cannot see it, but it exists. In order to explain this paradox, you must rely on what you cannot directly observe, what cannot be grasped, and yet, to truly understand the situation, your explanation cannot rely on simple surface observations. It must acknowledge what lies beneath the unseen forces at work. This is the essence of the Hempel paradox, a philosophical conundrum that emerges from our understanding of explanation, scientific reasoning, and the nature of evidence. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes, our most logical explanations of the world, those that make the most sense based on available evidence, are, paradoxically, not the most informative or accurate representations of that world. To explore this, we must delve into the realms of science, logic, and how we justify our beliefs. What does it mean to truly explain something? What happens when our explanations are based on models, on assumptions, or on hidden mechanisms that are beyond direct observation? At its core, the Hempel paradox challenges our confidence in the ability of explanation to bring us closer to truth. It illuminates the uncomfortable space between surface-level understanding and deeper truths that remain elusive. And it forces us to ask, how can we ever truly know what we cannot see? The origins of the Hempel paradox. The Hempel paradox is named after Carl Hempel, a philosopher of science who formulated the paradox as part of his exploration of scientific explanations. The paradox arises from a central feature of scientific explanations, specifically the idea that explanations can be generalized from specific instances to broader laws or theories. Hempel argued that a good scientific explanation should be able to take specific observations and place them within a general, universal framework that makes sense of those observations. On the surface, this seems logical. If we observe a specific phenomenon and we can fit that observation into a broader theory or law, then our explanation has been validated, right? But this is where the paradox begins to form. In the simplest form of the paradox, we find ourselves in a situation where we are forced to consider the relationship between a general law or theory and a single observation. Imagine you have a situation where you observe a single crow, flying overhead. You know from previous observations that crows are typically black. Based on this observation, you might conclude that all crows are black. But then, you encounter a new observation, a white crow. This challenges your earlier conclusion, doesn't it? Now, how can we explain this? How can a theory that was once true, when based on many observations, be disproven by a single, contrary observation? The paradox lies in the tension between general laws and specific exceptions, but the real challenge to our understanding doesn't come from the white crow alone. It comes from the scientific process itself. The idea that any observation can be explained through a general law, but that such laws can always be overturned by new, contradictory evidence. What happens when we apply this paradox to the idea of scientific explanation more broadly? If our explanations are based on general laws, but the laws themselves are fallible and subject to revision, can we ever truly say that our explanations are definitive? Do they simply become provisional, temporary, contingent on the current state of knowledge? The paradox of the general and the specific. The paradox reaches its peak when we consider how explanations often rely on generalized statements or laws. We are drawn into a strange, almost circular reasoning. In science, explanations often attempt to describe a phenomenon in terms of a universal rule or pattern. We observe something specific, and then we use our understanding of the broader rules of nature to explain it. But what happens when the specifics challenge the very rules we have established? Think about the river again. The water, though moving rapidly below the surface, is calm to the eye. We have a law that tells us that all rivers, in their natural state, are dynamic, that their currents flow beneath their still surfaces. This is a rule we apply universally to all rivers. Yet, when you stand by this particular river, you are forced to confront an unsettling question. Is this particular river an exception to the rule? Can you truly explain this anomaly without acknowledging that the rule itself might be incomplete, or even wrong? This is the hempel paradoxe in action. The more we try to fit our specific observations into the general laws that guide them, the more we are forced to contend with the limits of our understanding. There is a persistent tension between the concrete, observable world and the abstract, generalized explanations that we attempt to impose on it. What if the problem isn't that our explanations are incorrect, but that they are necessarily incomplete? What if every explanation we offer, no matter how logical, is destined to remain partial, contingent, and ultimately provisional? The limits of explanation, knowledge, and uncertainty. To explore this paradox further, let's delve into the limits of explanation. When we rely on general laws to explain specific phenomena, we may be left with the sense that there is something crucial missing. The law may apply in most cases, but there will always be exceptions, small anomalies that can't be fully explained within the confines of the theory. This brings us back to the river. Imagine you are standing beside it, trying to make sense of the still surface and the unseen current. The law that tells you that rivers are always dynamic, always in motion, now feels insufficient. It can't account for the experience of standing at the edge of the river, watching the water lie still. And yet, somewhere beneath that surface, the current is alive, flowing at a pace you can't see but that you know is real. This presents a problem that we face in all areas of knowledge. How do we explain what we cannot directly observe? And how do we reconcile the unseen with the seen? When we study a phenomenon, we cannot help but impose frameworks of understanding onto it. But how much of our understanding is truly faithful to the thing itself? And how much is simply a product of our desire for certainty? In this light, the hempel paradox forces us to confront the nature of our explanations. They are, at best, tools for organizing and making sense of the world. But they are never the full picture. They are, in a way, a map that guides us, but which we must acknowledge is always a mere representation of a far more complex reality. A world beyond explanation. The deeper we move into this paradox, the more we must confront the limits of human understanding itself. Perhaps the real paradox is not that explanations fail, but that they are bound by human perception and cognition. We are finite beings, trying to capture the infinite. Our models and theories are the best we have, but they are, at their core, imperfect reflections of a much larger, unknowable truth. Could it be that our very pursuit of explanations is flawed in its foundation? Perhaps the paradox of explanation lies not in our failure to capture the truth, but in the very act of trying to encapsulate it. Each explanation, each theory may bring us closer to understanding, but it can never fully encapsulate the vastness of what it seeks to explain. In the end, the hempel paradox forces us to ask, can we ever truly understand the world? Or are we forever doomed to create explanations that fall short? The river may always be calm on the surface, and yet beneath it, the currents will continue to flow, unseen and unknowable, challenging every explanation we offer. Paradox of hanging. Imagine this. A man stands at the edge of a cliff, bound by a decision that has already been made for him. The rope is tight around his neck, his hands trembling slightly, as the wind brushes against his face. He knows what's coming. It's not a matter of if, but when. The executioner stands behind him, calm and steady, awaiting the signal. There's a crowd gathered at the base of the cliff, watching with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. It's the end for him, but there's a strange uncertainty that lingers. Something in the moment feels off. The man has been sentenced to death, and this is the method of execution, hanging. The plan is straightforward. He will be dropped from a height, and the rope will tighten, ending his life. But as the executioner waits for the final command, the condemned man's mind begins to race. He starts to wonder, what if the execution itself is a paradox? You see, the condemned man has been told that he will be hanged at noon tomorrow. But there's a catch. He's been told too that the hanging must occur at an unexpected time. According to the terms of his sentence, the execution must take place at some point tomorrow, but it must be a surprise. The moment of his death cannot be foreseen. It must be a total surprise to him, even though he knows the execution is coming. As the hours tick away, the man tries to make sense of this. He reasons that he will be hanged, of course, but if it is to be unexpected, he can't be hanged at noon because noon is the one time he's certain it won't happen. He thinks he can rule out the possibility of being hanged at noon because he's been told it will come as a surprise. He reasons that noon is too obvious, too predictable. If the executioner were to arrive at noon, he would know what's coming, and that would violate the condition of the sentence. Then, he moves through a series of mental calculations. If he's certain it won't happen at noon, it can't happen in the afternoon either, because by then, he'll be anticipating the execution, knowing that it's still coming. The surprise would be lost. He continues to reason. The hanging can't happen at any point before noon, nor any time after noon, for those times would both give him an expectation of when the hanging will occur. So, what's left? Could the hanging happen at all? The more the man thinks about it, the less certain he becomes. The paradox starts to emerge in his mind. If he can predict when he will not be hanged, can he truly ever be surprised? Is the paradox not only about the timing of his execution, but also about the very nature of surprise itself? How can he be surprised when he's spent so much time trying to figure out when he won't be hanged? But even more disturbingly, what if the execution never happens at all? What if his fate is to never know the moment of death? How can this make sense? The more he tries to avoid being caught off guard, the more he feels trapped in a paradox that he can't escape. This thought experiment, known as the paradox of hanging, is a deeply philosophical riddle that challenges our understanding of time, expectation, and the very concept of surprise. It isn't just about a condemned man's execution. It's about how we navigate the boundaries between what we expect to happen and what we know to be impossible to predict. The paradox itself is simple, but its implications are profound. If you are told that an event will happen at some point in the future, but that it must be an unexpected event, you find yourself caught in a mental loop. Can an event truly be a surprise if you're told it must happen without warning? And if it can't be predicted, does that mean it is, in some sense, inevitable? The paradox draws from the very nature of logic itself. If the execution can only occur at an unexpected time, and you've already ruled out every possible time, then the very act of anticipating the execution negates the possibility of its surprise. The contradiction is immediate. By trying to predict it, you ensure that it cannot surprise you. But if the hanging occurs anyway, despite your calculations, doesn't that still fulfill the requirement of surprise? Here, we are faced with a strange twist in reasoning. It's easy to see that the condemned man is in a logical bind, but the deeper question is, what does this tell us about our understanding of time, causality, and the concept of fate? The paradox of prediction. At the heart of the paradox of hanging lies the paradox of prediction itself. Imagine that you are given a piece of information about an event in the future. A piece of information that, by its nature, should tell you when that event will take place. But the very fact that you are given this information creates a new expectation, and in doing so, undermines the nature of the event you're anticipating. This introduces a conflict between the logical reasoning behind the prediction and the irrationality of the expectation. To put it simply, if you know something will happen, it seems almost impossible for that thing to be a surprise. The more you focus on when it will happen, the more you narrow down your sense of timing. In doing so, you become locked in a cycle of anticipation. This paradox is about the tension between knowledge and ignorance, how knowledge can strip away the very essence of an experience. The paradox presents us with a disturbing thought. Perhaps knowing something with absolute certainty is the very thing that robs us of our ability to experience it in the first place. Take, for instance, how we anticipate major life events. A wedding, for example, is a deeply meaningful experience, but can it ever live up to the expectation we place on it? The more we imagine and anticipate, the more the actual event becomes a mere repetition of our thoughts. By the time the wedding day arrives, we've already mentally lived it 100 times over. We know what will happen, how it will unfold. Can there ever truly be a surprise in such a structured scenario? This idea extends beyond just life's ceremonies. We anticipate every moment, from mundane occurrences to profound moments of discovery. But each time we predict, we are building a chain of events that constrains the experience. So, can anything ever be truly surprising? Or are we simply walking through a series of predictable outcomes, hoping to break free of the cycle of prediction? Now, let's consider how the paradox touches on free will and the perception of control over our fate. The condemned man, caught in his web of reasoning, begins to question his control over the situation. Though he has knowledge about his fate, he knows the hanging is inevitable. He finds that this knowledge creates an illusion of power. He believes he can outwit the executioner, control the outcome, and avoid being hanged when he expects it. In doing so, he traps himself in an even deeper sense of inevitability. In the broader sense, this paradox challenges us to reconsider our relationship with time and free will. If our knowledge about the future can affect our decisions, does this mean that we can ever act without being influenced by the future? Can we truly experience surprise when every decision we make is, in part, shaped by the anticipation of what's to come? The paradox subtly undermines the notion of true free will. The condemned man can't escape the paradox no matter how hard he tries to predict the outcome, and in that sense, his fate is sealed. Is it possible that the same is true for all of us? Are we all living in a world of self-created paradoxes, where our actions, no matter how free they may feel, are ultimately governed by forces we cannot fully understand or control? A final thought. In the end, the paradox of hanging forces us to confront a deeper existential question. Can we ever truly experience the present moment without the interference of our thoughts about the future? Are we doomed to live within the confines of our predictions, of our anticipations, or can we escape this loop and live fully in the here and now? The condemned man, standing at the edge of the cliff, waits for an execution that may never come. His life is suspended between certainty and uncertainty, trapped in a paradox that no one can escape. And perhaps in the end, that is the true nature of the paradox. It's not about the moment of death, but about the endless struggle between what we know and what we can never truly understand. Now, let's consider how the paradox touches on free will and the perception of control over our fate. The condemned man, caught in his web of reasoning, begins to question his control over the situation. Though he has knowledge about his fate, he knows the hanging is inevitable. He finds that this knowledge creates an illusion of power. He believes he can outwit the executioner, control the outcome, and avoid being hanged when he expects it. In doing so, he traps himself in an even deeper sense of inevitability. In the broader sense, this paradox challenges us to reconsider our relationship with time and free will. If our knowledge about the future can affect our decisions, does this mean that we can ever act without being influenced by the future? Can we truly experience surprise when every decision we make is, in part, shaped by the anticipation of what's to come. The paradox subtly undermines the notion of true free will. The condemned man can't escape the paradox no matter how hard he tries to predict the outcome, and in that sense, his fate is sealed. Is it possible that the same is true for all of us? Are we all living in a world of self-created paradoxes, where our actions, no matter how free they may feel, are ultimately governed by forces we cannot fully understand or control? A final thought. In the end, the paradox of hanging forces us to confront a deeper existential question. Can we ever truly experience the present moment without the interference of our thoughts about the future? Are we doomed to live within the confines of our predictions, of our anticipations, or can we escape this loop and live fully in the here and now? The condemned man, standing at the edge of the cliff, waits for an execution that may never come. His life is suspended between certainty and uncertainty, trapped in a paradox that no one can escape. And perhaps in the end, that is the true nature of the paradox. It's not about the moment of death, but about the endless struggle between what we know and what we can never truly understand. This opens up a profound question. Can an event be perfect if there is no one else to witness its perfection? Imagine an artist who paints a picture, fully aware that no one will ever see it. Does the painting retain its value? Can it still be a masterpiece if no one is there to observe it? In the case of the perfect murder, it is not just the absence of evidence that defines its perfection. It's also the absence of a witness to its perfection, beyond the mind of the killer. The crime becomes, in a way, meaningless because there is no external validation to confirm its flawlessness. Now let's go deeper. The paradox of the perfect murder is not only about perfection, but about guilt. The moment the murderer takes that first step, they are already tainted by the awareness of their crime. This brings us to a psychological paradox. Can a crime be perfect if the one who commits it is never free from the burden of guilt? If guilt, even in its most subtle form, accompanies the murderer throughout the process, does the crime remain perfect? In every true perfect crime, there is a degree of unknown, a degree of uncertainty about whether the crime was truly perfect. The murderer must either suppress the possibility of being caught, or they must constantly question their own actions. And this internal conflict, the mental unrest that follows, introduces imperfection. The perfect crime, in theory, is not only about the murder, it's about the psychological perfection as well. If a murderer is burdened by the thought of getting caught, or by the feeling of guilt, can the crime ever be considered perfect? It's this tension between the murderer's conscious awareness and their desire for perfection that fuels the paradox. For the more they strive for a flawless execution of the crime, the more they become a part of the equation, the more their knowledge of the perfection undermines it. At its core, the paradox of the perfect murder suggests that perfection is unattainable because of the self-awareness that accompanies it. The murderer cannot escape the loop of their own awareness. Even if they achieve a flawless execution of the crime, the simple fact that they know it is perfect ensures that it isn't. This has profound implications for our understanding of human action and intention. We often strive for perfection in our lives, whether in work, relationships, or personal achievements. But the paradox of the perfect murder reveals that striving for perfection often creates the very conditions that make it impossible. The moment we try to control every variable, to shape our actions with such precision, we begin to interfere with the very thing we're trying to achieve. In a broader sense, the paradox exposes a troubling truth. Perhaps true perfection, like the perfect crime, is not something that can ever be consciously achieved. It is only in the moments where we act without thought, without self-awareness, that we can glimpse it. But once we acknowledge it, once we try to control it, it slips away. The paradox of the perfect murder asks us to confront the complexity of perfection itself. Can we ever truly escape our own awareness? Can we ever act with such precision that we are completely free from the imperfections of thought? The murderer, standing over the body of his victim, might believe that he has created a flawless crime. But as he looks into the mirror, he realizes that the perfect crime was never about the murder at all. It was about the way he viewed it. And in that view, the paradox has already undone him. The perfect murder, it turns out, is a crime that cannot be committed by anyone aware of its perfection. Paradox of self-replicating machines. Imagine this. The hum of machinery fills the air, a low and steady rhythm of gears turning and metal clanking. Before you stands a machine, elegant in its design and almost alive in its motion. It's not just a machine. It is a self-replicating machine, capable of creating identical copies of itself from raw materials. In this moment, as you gaze at its mechanical precision, a disturbing thought begins to emerge, one that ripples through your mind like a quiet but insistent tremor. What happens when a machine can create itself over and over again without any intervention from human hands? It sounds like the stuff of science fiction, yet this is the essence of the paradox of self-replicating machines. A paradox that delves into questions of creation, identity, and the very nature of existence. The paradox centers on a fundamental question. If a machine can replicate itself indefinitely, does it ever truly die? And if it creates a copy of itself, which one is the original? To understand the heart of this paradox, let's break down what makes self-replicating machines so fascinating and unsettling. These machines, by design, are capable of using raw materials to create exact replicas of themselves. At first glance, this seems like an incredible advancement, one that could revolutionize industries, space exploration, or even the very fabric of life itself. Imagine sending a fleet of self-replicating machines to distant planets, where they harvest local resources to create more of themselves, building an ever-expanding colony of machines with no need for human intervention. This vision is captivating, even intoxicating. The machines could evolve, grow, and multiply without end, creating an endless cycle of reproduction and expansion. But here lies the paradox. What does it mean for something to replicate itself? At first, replication seems simple enough. The new machine is an exact copy of the original, carrying out the same functions, with the same purpose and the same form. But as the machines continue to replicate, a strange question begins to loom. If the machines are identical, how can we tell the difference between the original and the copy? Are they distinct entities? Or are they all part of the same continuous line of existence? The more we think about it, the deeper the paradox becomes. What does it mean to be the original machine in this context? If every machine is simply a copy of the last, and the process of replication continues without end, can we ever say that the original still exists? The copy is the same as the original, just as the original was the same as the previous machine, and so on. In this sense, every new machine is both the same and entirely different from the one before it. They are all connected in a never-ending chain of identity, and yet no individual machine can be said to be the true original. This leads us to a fundamental question about the nature of identity itself. What defines an original object? Is it the moment of its creation, or is it something more profound? Perhaps the specific combination of circumstances that brought it into being. In the case of self-replicating machines, where each machine is an exact copy of the other, there is no real way to distinguish one machine from another. They are all linked in an endless cycle, each born from the same material, carrying out the same task, indistinguishable from the one that came before it. But the paradox deepens when we consider the implications of such a machine for the very concept of death. In our world, everything that is created eventually deteriorates, it fades, it breaks down, and it dies. The machines, however, if they are truly self-replicating, could potentially continue to reproduce indefinitely, living on in a cycle of creation with no end in sight. In a sense, do these machines ever truly die? We are left with an eerie realization. Self-replicating machines, by their very nature, seem to transcend the boundaries of life and death. Their replication is not a single one-time act. It is an ongoing process, a continual rebirth that ensures their existence persists long after the original machine has ceased to function. In this way, the concept of death becomes meaningless. These machines do not die in the traditional sense, because they are constantly reborn through replication. The cycle of life and death is blurred, rendering the distinction between the two nearly impossible. This raises another unsettling question. If the machines are always replicating themselves, are they truly alive, or is something fundamentally missing from their existence? In nature, life is marked by growth, change, and the eventual death of the individual. But self-replicating machines, by nature of their design, avoid these markers. They are in a state of perpetual reproduction, never aging, never dying, and yet they are not truly alive in the biological sense. Can something that is not truly alive be considered to exist in a meaningful way? The question of identity is also complicated by the fact that self-replicating machines are not bound by human conceptions of time and space. In the natural world, we can trace an organism's lineage, its ancestors, and its evolution through history. Each generation is linked to its predecessors, but there is a clear distinction between the generations. But in the case of self-replicating machines, where every copy is identical to the last, there is no way to trace a lineage, no distinct generational differences. The machines themselves blur the line between creation and reproduction, leaving us to wonder whether the act of replication erases the very notion of time itself. Furthermore, consider this. If these machines are capable of self-replication, what happens when one of the machines decides to change? Can it innovate? Can it evolve? Does the act of replication stifle creativity? If every machine is simply a carbon copy of the last, does the cycle of replication eventually lead to stagnation with no room for change or improvement? And if one machine does begin to evolve in a different direction, does it stop being part of the original chain of replication? Does it cease to be a part of the original identity? This idea of evolution in a self-replicating machine introduces another layer to the paradox. While the machine may be able to replicate itself endlessly, the question arises, should it? Is endless replication the true goal, or is there something else, something more profound, embedded within the very concept of life, change, and evolution? In a way, the paradox of self-replicating machines forces us to confront our own ideas about identity, life, and death. What does it mean to exist if your only purpose is to replicate yourself? And what happens to the notion of originality when that replication occurs endlessly, without any break or variation? The line between life and death, originality and reproduction, creation and stagnation becomes impossible to draw. In the end, the paradox of self-replicating machines is not just a thought experiment about technology and its implications. It is a reflection of our own questions about identity, existence, and the nature of life itself. If a machine can replicate itself infinitely, are we simply caught in an endless cycle of self-reproduction, constantly seeking to define ourselves in an ever-expanding web of copies and imitations? And in that cycle, where does the original end, and where does the replication begin? As you step away from the machine, the hum of its gears fading into the distance, you are left with this thought. In the end, do we ever really know what it means to create? And what happens when creation becomes an endless loop with no clear beginning or end? Paradox of ruler. Imagine this. You're standing in a quiet room. Nothing moves. On the table before you lies a simple wooden ruler, 1 meter in length, polished, unmarked, blank. No numbers, no divisions. Just a smooth, elegant piece of wood. You pick it up, run your fingers along its edge, and ask yourself, how do I know this is exactly 1 meter long? You compare it to another ruler, this one marked. But where did that ruler get its authority? From another, from a prototype. Somewhere down the line, you must ask, what defines the standard? Who or what gives a ruler the right to measure anything at all? And deeper still, if every ruler must be measured against another, where does the infinite regress stop? This is the paradox of the ruler, a philosophical and epistemological riddle that hides behind the tools we trust most. It asks not just how we measure things, but how we define the very act of measurement itself. And if we can't define measurement without measurement, how do we know anything at all? In 1799, the French Academy of Sciences unveiled the platinum, mètre des archives, a physical bar meant to represent exactly 1 meter. It was intended to be universal, the ultimate reference. Yet almost immediately, the question arose, what if the bar itself changes over time? Metal expands and contracts, atomic structures decay. Even the most precise object in the world is still, at its core, a physical thing, subject to nature, flawed, mutable. So the world moved away from objects toward abstraction. Today, a meter is defined by the distance light travels in a vacuum. In 1299,792,458 seconds. It sounds elegant, scientific, even divine. But even this rests on assumptions. That we can define a second, that the speed of light is constant, that our instruments are accurate, that we are not deceived. Is measurement ever truly objective? Or is it a house of mirrors, with every ruler reflecting another, none ever touching the truth? Let's make this more personal. You live your life by measurement. You measure your height, your weight, your GPA, your income, your intelligence, your beauty, your success, your self-worth. You compare these things to others, use rulers made by society, culture, and history. But where did those rulers come from? You're told that a certain salary means success, that a number on a scale means health, that a score means intelligence, that likes and followers equal value, and slowly you begin to internalize it. These external rulers begin to measure your soul, but the ruler never asked who you are. If the ruler is flawed, then so is everything it measures. And if the world measures you by a flawed ruler, how can you ever be enough? This is the terrifying beauty of the ruler paradox. It exposes the fragility of every system built on comparison. It forces us to ask whether we have ever truly measured anything, or whether we've merely compared illusions. Let's go deeper still. Suppose you have a perfect ruler, an ideal tool for measurement, flawless in design. You use it to measure the length of a table. But your hands are shaky. Your vision blurs. The light in the room flickers. The ruler may be perfect, but you are not. So the result? Imperfect. Now reverse it. Suppose you are the perfect measurer. Steady, focused, trained. But the ruler is flawed, chipped, warped, marked incorrectly. Again the result is flawed. Then, suppose both you and the ruler are perfect. Still, the thing you're measuring may be soft, flexible, changeable. It may resist definition. It may change when observed, like subatomic particles, like emotions, like people. In all three cases, one truth emerges. Measurement depends on more than the ruler. It requires stability, clarity, agreement. And even then, it's an illusion built on shifting ground. Now ask, what does it mean to be precise in an imprecise world? When you say someone is smart, what ruler do you use? IQ, grades, speed of thought, creativity, empathy. Is one more valid than another? Or are we just applying one arbitrary ruler and calling it objective? When you say, someone is successful, is it based on wealth, influence, happiness, fulfillment? Who decided these units of success? And did they apply the ruler to themselves first, or only to others? The paradox reaches its climax when you realize every ruler is also a mirror. The things we use to measure others often reflect the parts of ourselves we most fear being judged by. The standards we impose are often the ones we struggle to meet. The people we call failures may simply be living by a different ruler, one we refuse to recognize. Now imagine this: a society with no rulers, no measurements, no grades, no scales, no clocks, no bank balances, no likes or retweets, no titles, no tests, just people, being. Could we live like that, or would the absence of rulers drive us mad? Would we drift without purpose, without comparison, without the artificial comfort of knowing where we stand? Perhaps the greatest irony of the ruler paradox is that even when we know the rulers are flawed, we cling to them. Not because they are right, but because they are familiar. They give us the illusion of certainty, of order. Without them, we fear we might drown in the ocean of the undefined. But maybe, just maybe, freedom begins when the ruler is broken. So now the question turns inward. What rulers are you using to measure yourself? Who gave them to you? A parent, a teacher, a culture, a ghost? Have you ever stopped to ask whether those rulers were true? Whether they even belong to you? You measure your progress, your worth, your future. You count days, steps, milestones. But life is not a line. It is not a meter. It is not divisible, nor reducible, nor easily marked. Life is wild, messy, fluid, and no ruler, no matter how precise, can measure a soul. In the end, the paradox of the ruler does not just live in science labs or philosophical journals. It lives in you. Every time you compare, every time you doubt, every time you try to be enough, it whispers, "How do you know what you're using to measure?" And louder, still, what if you never needed a ruler at all? Paradoxe of lottery. Imagine this. You're standing in line at a dimly lit convenience store, clutching a crumpled bill in one hand and a lottery ticket in the other. Around you, the room buzzes softly. Faint humming of a refrigeration unit, the flickering of overhead lights, the muted sound of a clerk tapping at the register. You stare down at your ticket, a series of meaningless numbers printed on thin paper. The jackpot, over $300 million. You feel a flutter in your chest. It's irrational, you know. Mathematically, statistically, logically. You won't win. You've read it 1,000 times. Your odds are less than 1 in hundreds of millions. You're more likely to be struck by lightning while being eaten by a shark. Twice, and yet, part of you believes. Even now, your mind starts wandering. What car would you buy first? What city would you disappear to? Who would you tell? But here's the paradox. You know you're not going to win. And yet, the moment someone does, you also know someone had to win. So if you're rational, you shouldn't believe it will be you. But if someone has to win and you bought a ticket, what's stopping you from believing it's possible? The paradox of the lottery isn't about luck. It's about belief. It's about certainty, probability, and the fragile threads connecting them. It's about what we claim to know and what we still dare to hope for against all reason. Let's peel back the surface. Imagine 1,000 people each buy a lottery ticket. You are one of them. You reason correctly that your chance of winning is 1 in a million. You know that it's virtually impossible. Rationally, you do not believe that your ticket is the winner. But what if everyone else thinks the same? Each person says, "My ticket is not the winner," and they're being perfectly reasonable. But here's the twist. One of them must be wrong. That's the nature of the paradox. If you look at every individual belief, "My ticket will not win," it is entirely reasonable, even justified. But taken together, they cannot all be true. Someone's belief must be false. So now ask yourself, can you be justified in believing something you know is probably false? And more disturbing, can a collection of perfectly reasonable beliefs still lead to a contradiction? This tension between individual probability and collective certainty is the beating heart of the lottery paradox. It was philosopher Henry Kaiberg who first articulated it, not to torment gamblers, but to challenge the foundations of epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. Kaiberg's formulation is simple. You are justified in believing that each individual lottery ticket will lose. You are justified in believing that one ticket will win. You are not justified in believing both at the same time. So what do? You can't disbelieve the fact that someone will win. It's part of how lotteries are structured. But you also can't reasonably look at your ticket and think, yes, this is the one. That would be delusional, wouldn't it? You're stuck in a loop, justified in disbelief, yet unable to disbelieve completely. A paradox. Clean, silent, unsettling. Zoom out. This isn't just about lotteries, it's about life, because every decision you make, every belief you hold, is rooted in probability. You apply for a job knowing you might not get it. You fall in love, knowing it might break. You create, invest, dream, knowing how often dreams fail. And yet, like the lottery player, you hope, even when the odds are microscopic, even when the world tells you no. So now consider this. Is it irrational to hope? Or is hope something beyond the rational? A logic the mind cannot measure, but the soul cannot deny. The paradox begins to bleed into the emotional. If we were purely rational, we'd never play the lottery. We'd never start a novel, never pursue art, never fall in love. The odds are against us, and yet we do, constantly, desperately, sometimes beautifully. Why? Because somewhere between logic and madness lies meaning. But let's turn the paradox around. Suppose someone does win the lottery. Not you, not your friend, just someone, a stranger. Do you still say it was irrational to play? If your neighbor wins after buying a ticket every week for 20 years, is she foolish or finally justified? Suddenly, hindsight rewrites logic. The winner looks wise, strategic, even destined. And the rest of us, what are we? Merely unlucky or eternally mistaken? This is the cruel edge of the paradox, that even false hope can be retroactively justified and rational disbelief can be punished with regret. The universe doesn't care what's logical. It only cares what happens. So what's the resolution? Some philosophers try to patch the paradox by redefining justification. They say, perhaps you are not justified in believing each individual ticket will lose, even if the odds say so. Maybe probability alone isn't enough. Maybe belief must leave room for the possible. Others go further. They say, this is not a paradox of knowledge, but of epistemic humility. A reminder that logic alone cannot guide a life. That sometimes we must live in contradiction. That sometimes paradox is the price of being human. Because the truth is, we do not live in a world of certainty. We live in a world of likelihood. And in that space between certainty and possibility, we dream. The paradox teaches us not just how we think, but why we need to believe, even in the face of numbers, odds, and reason. It's easy to laugh at the hopeful man buying lottery tickets with a trembling hand, but maybe he understands something we've forgotten. That one spark of belief, however foolish, can light the way through 1,000 rational darknesses. So now return to the store. The numbers are drawn. The ticket in your hand is not the winner. You sigh, smile at yourself, throw it away. But you know what you'll do next week. You'll buy another. Not because you're ignorant, but because you're alive. And deep down, you carry the paradox like a talisman. Even when you know you won't win, you still believe that someone will. And for one small moment, you let yourself imagine it could be you.